For the last few days since the start of the siege, Steve and the other members of Doom had been run through constant drills and trials by the Archon as she conjured up threat after threat for them to deal with all while navigating dark corridor illusions that she set up deeper in the forest out of sight of the walls of the city. Steve certainly regretted ever saying that he was going to be bored, and the others also regretted Steve's poor choice in words. For now they were taking a much-needed break. Larry was so tired and spent from the last round he was passed out face down in the grass, snoring loudly and aggressively as if to make it clear he was still alive. Sherry had her feet in a small tub of water as she tried to relax, and Steve had a water skin he'd turned to ice pressed against his left eye, which was swelling up. Only Fenrina was in good spirits as she stirred a cooking pot over a fire she had going to make them all soup for the evening. "Hey, Steve, I was meaning to ask you something," she mentioned as she looked over at him. "Yeah?" he asked, blinking a few times as he tried to focus while looking over at her, adjusting the frozen water skin against his face. "Why are humans bad at magic?" It took a few seconds for Steve to try and process the question as he looked from Fenrina around the clearing for a moment and then back. "What? I'm not bad at magic." He sounded more confused than insulted. "No, you're great, but I mean like humans in general. I was talking to the Archon about the history of the city we're attacking. She said it's been attacked lots of times, by orcs, by other elves, by, those other people from the north I forget? The tattoo ones," she said. "Jenna," Steve answered. "Yeah, them. Now I get the Gen and the elves knowing magic, but how did orcs beat humans to it? You said it yourself, you're the third human mage, but like, humans have been around for hundreds of years. Why did it take so long for a human to be able to cast it?" she asked, as she wafted some of the smoke from the soup towards her as she sniffed and then added a bit more dill. "Well, lots of different kinds of magic," Steve started to explain. "The orcs don't technically cast magic. They've got shamans. Shamans commune with the spirits and the spirits do the actual casting." "No human spirits?" Fenrina asked. "Nah." Steve shook his head. "There are some who will commune with the spirits of other people, but they're shamans, not mages. And as for why humans took so long to get mages, well, as I explained to the tribunes, if you use magic wrong, you explode, or burst into flames. It's easy to lose control, especially when you have no idea what you're doing. And no one wanted to teach us, for political reasons and military as well. So, we just kind of messed about until the Archon finally picked a few of us to teach. Now there are human mages. In time, I'm sure the number will grow. I mean, look, I've been a mage for a year and already I spilled the secret of shields and dispels to Almera. That'll cause all sorts of issues, I'm sure." "So why did the Archon pick you?" Fenrina asked, and Steve just sat there quietly as he thought it over. To be honest, I never asked," he admitted. "I can tell you if you like." Steve jumped a bit as the Archon seemed to more or less appear behind him. But since he'd been staring at Fenrina, she could very well have just walked behind him, and he didn't notice. "Please, I'm curious," Fenrina replied with her usual big grin, the werehusky always full of energy. "Yes, I'm actually curious myself." The group looked over as Ivalinus and George approached from the woods to join them around the fire as Fenrina made soup. "Lunch break?" Steve asked as George nodded. "Yeah, they're changing out the cohorts, so we've got an hour for lunch unless something happens. Soup smells good," he mentioned as he leaned over the pot to look into it. "Thanks, but it's Steve's recipe," Fenrina explained as she went back to stirring. "Ah, yes, no matter what else he sucks at, Steve is good at cooking, which is good because he was a shitty farmer," George teased as Steve snorted. "Pfft." He started but looked over at Fenrina and then Sherry glaring at him as he coughed and sighed. "Yeah, whatever, you were the You were mean enough to not tell me just what was going to happen to Mr. Blinky that day." George laughed as Steve said that. "That damn rabbit. I hated that rabbit. He would bite at my ankles and make me chase him all around the garden. I was so happy when the day rolled around." "He bit at your ankles and made him chase you because he knew you were evil," Steve countered. For me, he was sweet and nice and would always come hopping over whenever I was around. Do his little jump. Steve trailed off then as he shook his head. What happened? Fenrina finally asked. I was just a kid. 5, 6. He looked to George. I think. Right, Dad had come home from campaign, so it must have been the year of the consuls, Harry and Hank. I always liked that year, George mentioned. So then I was 6 and turned 7, Steve said after looking up at nothing for a minute while he did the math. Anyway, my dad came home from campaign. We're all excited. Mom tells George here to go get Mr. Blinky. I say that George is mean to him, so I'll go get him and bring him in. I think Dad wants to see him after being gone so long. I bring him to Mom and don't think anything of it. We're all playing around with Dad as he's talking and telling stories, and then dinner rolls around. Oh no, the Archon said as she knew where it was going, and Steve nodded. Oh, he loved it, George mentioned with glee. He went on and on about how the meal Mom made was so good and he'd never had it before. Second helpings. I don't get it, Fenrina said, looking confused. The meat in the meal that night, Steve sighed, was Mr. Blinky. I asked Mom what kind of chicken it was, and she told me it was rabbit, and I realized what I had done. George laughed again and slapped his brother on the back. Oh, he cried. He cried for like a week, the big baby. Hey, fuck you, Steve muttered, unable to hold back from cursing at the moment. Didn't you understand what happened to the animals on your farm? Sherry asked, looking curious herself. I was 6 or 7. It didn't really click. Steve waved his free hand in the air as the other kept the ice pressed to his eye. After that, it did. I had made friends with, all of the animals we had, even the cows. It all clicked. I felt awful. George laughed once more, and even Evelinus and Sherry chuckled a bit at his misfortune in his youth. I mean, you knew what beef was. We'd been eating Daisy for a few months leading up to the Mr. Blinky fiasco, George mentioned. I didn't get it, Steve stressed. I thought it was someone else's cow. I didn't think it was a cow I knew. I felt awful. Of course, now I know that all cows on Talaron are in the same death cult, so she probably enjoyed what happened, but I sure didn't know it back then. What? Death cult? Sherry asked, but Steve just waved it off. I couldn't take it. So I asked, begged, Mom to let me change my chores. I focused on the herb garden, and cooking and cleaning and anything not animal-related. Well, I took care of the cats, but even back then I understood they hunted rats. Never felt bad about the rats, he mused as he trailed off. Is that why you're so proficient with herbalism? Evelinus asked, suddenly understanding some of Steve's strengths. Careful there, Ives. Almost sounded like you were complimenting me there. Steve grinned at the elf, who just glared back. But then he nodded and went on. Yes. By the time I was taken to Arbutus, I'd spent years learning how to garden and cook, so herbalism and alchemy came naturally to me. Wasn't the Archon going to tell us why she picked you? Fenrina asked then as the group looked over at the Archon, who had been standing by quietly waiting. Oh, yes. Right, sorry, Steve said and nodded to her. It's quite all right, Stephen. I'm sorry about your pet rabbit, but at least you worked things out. But I have a question of my own. Even after all that, you still eat meat? She asked. What? Oh yeah, I love meat. I just didn't like knowing who I ate. I prefer not to think about it. But also in the interest of fairness, it's why I eat a lot of meat from dire animals and other shit that actively tries to kill me. It makes it better. He shrugged. Except fish. I don't give a shit about fish at all. I mean, I don't care about if they can eat me. Because I know for a fact everything in the ocean tries to eat everything else in the ocean if it's smaller. So I'm fine with killing fish. But I digress. Why'd you pick me? He then extended his foot to kick Larry and make the dwarf roll over onto his side to stop snoring, which didn't even wake the dwarf up. The Archon looked off for a moment, the swirling stars and nebula that filled her ethereal body shimmering for a few seconds. Every other year when it's time to pick new candidates, I enter a trance and search out across Talaron to anyone the selection committee might have missed. Usually it's because a particular person is well beyond the boundaries of civilization and hard to find. But I was also looking among the human populations because I felt it was time. I had searched for years prior and found a few possibly capable choices, but they were all limited. I wanted the first human mages to be able to truly excel and not just plod along, handicapped by their natural inabilities. First, I found Riava, heir to a human kingdom nestled among the elven nations. She had been raised among visiting elven court mages and witnessed their magic firsthand. Her father had hired the best elven tutors he could, so it was little surprise that she had picked up on the magic arts. Then there was Cariston. Born to a high merchant, low-noble family, he was surrounded by books, and while his family didn't have elven tutors, they were able to afford an excellent education for him in the Dwarven Embassy. He was always fascinated with how to build things and the stories of the dwarven constructs that rolled through the city from time to time. So I assumed here we have two best young human minds that are just perfect for the academy. I thought my search was over, but something tugged at me. The tendrils of magic begged me to keep searching, and so I roamed the world for days, confused about who or what I could be missing. The more civilized Eastern continent wasn't where I should be. Perhaps a new gen I had missed? But no. Instead, I find a small farm in a nation I wasn't even familiar with, and in that farm I find Stephen. By now the group was staring at Steve, who was staring right back at the Archon. I couldn't follow the normal procedures since we had no contact with his nation, so I decided to handle it myself. Who was this strange child with no formal education who showed such great magic potential? The others had been shaped by their upbringing, Riava and the elves, Cariston and the dwarves. But who was this uniquely human student, I wondered. I teleported near the farm and approached him while he was in the herb garden. He stood and looked at me, rake in one hand. He didn't seem threatened, just curious. So I held out my hands and asked if he would like to learn magic. As I did that, I cast a little cantrip to summon a gorgeous bouquet of wildflowers to my hand. And what does he do? She let the question hang for a moment. He moves his hands like he saw me move mine. I see this concentrated look on his face, and a single daisy appears in his hand. Evelinus gasped as she said that, but the others seemed confused. Without any training? He just copied you? The elf asked. He did. No training, he just saw me do it and did his best to copy me, so I was startled and amazed, and I asked him, "What is your name, child?" At the time I thought this could be the first sorcerer in centuries, possibly a shining beacon of hope for humanity's future with magic. And he tells me, Steve. It was honestly a bit of a letdown. George and Sherry chuckled while Steve just glared at them. So I took him to the academy after explaining who I was to his parents and was set to train what I thought would be the greatest pupil I'd ever brought. Steve smiled wide, but then she continued. And then he ruined it. I think the story is supposed to end just before that last bit, Steve mentioned. Infraction after infraction, being caught in the girls' dorm several times. I was a growing boy, Steve protested. Arguing with the teachers, fighting with older students constantly. Talk shit, get hit, simple as that, Steve growled. Breaking test golems, classrooms, and even a protected practice chamber once. The group looked at Steve expecting another outburst, but this time he just shrugged, before the Archon continued. Constantly not doing his work. Very, very nearly about to drop out of the academy and end his training in the last months before graduation, only to save himself through a bet. I was so ready to be done with you, Stephen. I was nearly heartbroken that someone with so much promise constantly seemed to squander it. But having watched you work in my employ, I think I understand better now. I wanted you to be the best mage according to what I've seen in the past. And that's just not the case. You're not a sorcerer. You're not even a good classical mage, but you are an amazing magic user. A good spellslinger. Steve grinned as the Archon sighed. Yes, a good spellslinger. Though you better hope you never lose your book. As she said that, he gave his tome a pat. I've never met anyone able to mimic and cast in all schools of magic as well as you can, aside from myself. That much is clear. If I can see someone else do it, that means I can do it, Steve said with confidence. You are very uniquely human among magic users, Stephen, the Archon said, and he smiled. The discussion was cut short then, as a runner came sprinting into the clearing. "Legate, the gates of the city are opening. The elven army marches forth." The group started to get up then. "Larry, wake the fuck up and heal my eye," Steve growled as he gave the dwarf another shove with his foot. "Where are my boots?" Sherry asked as she looked around. "But what about the soup?" Fenrina asked, as she quickly tried to slurp on a big spoon of it only to gasp and wave on her tongue as it was too hot. The Archon just sighed and looked out through the forests to the walls of the city in the distance. She knew what came next. It was time for Spellslinger to stop time travel. The history books would speak highly of the speech that General Joavia the Pure would give to her soldiers before the battle. It was highly regarded as one of the greatest speeches before a battle that was ever given. The Almerans themselves all admitted that it was a very good speech. Consul Gary as well was known for great speeches himself, and is a well-quoted individual in Almaran society, as well as across Talaron in later centuries. But for that day the consul was not feeling like giving a big grandiose speech, so he simply rode his horse before his assembled legions and let his voice echo out, assisted by a bit of magic loaned to him by the Archon. "Men, many of you have been wondering why we went to war so hastily. Why we assembled and marched while the majority of our army is elsewhere. It's because those elves are fucking around with magic. And it's very simple. If they win, it will be worse than death for us. They will unmake us. We will cease to exist. Our friends and family will cease to exist. Almera will cease to exist. Humanity itself across this world will very likely cease to exist." He paused then, letting his words sink in a little. "So don't lose." And with that guided his horse through the cohorts back to his place in the center of the line, not surrounded by his elite Praetorian guard like normal, but among the youngest and least experienced of his men. Miles away near the south of the city, Steve watched from his control over one of the crows in the sky. "We need to wait for the battle to get started, but I hope Gary knows what he's doing. He's got his Praetorian guard on the flanks for some reason." "Think he's got a chance of winning?" Sherry asked. Steve sighed softly as he looked at the image before his eyes. The Almarans were 80,000 strong, and of course he felt pride within him as he looked across the uniform ranks of Red Legionnaires. But across from them was the elven army, which wasn't looking timid by any means. Their polished and well-crafted armor glittered in the sun, banners from all of their noble houses and families fluttering in the wind. The story the banners told were testaments to their centuries of undefeated combat around the city, and their force was clearly larger than that of the Almarans. He knew that many of their number were archers, but seeing the lines from the sky made it seem different. This wasn't just a skirmish or a small battle. This was two large armies squaring off, each with a size equal to that of a decent-sized town. "Well, he always sold it to me. I mean his plans and stuff. Him and George would just go on about how the Alsaurians didn't have a chance, but I have no idea. Their archers are out front and getting closer." While he focused on the battle, the other members of Doom were watching the woods around them as they waited the signal to approach the city. "Okay, the elven volley seems to be mostly getting blocked by shields and, shields? Barriers? Is that the term I was going to use for the magic shields? Whatever. The mules and ballistae are firing back." Steve literally had a bird's-eye view of the battle as the crow flew above the field. The Almaran siege engines had their fire blocked by elven barriers as well before the elven army tried to throw around their own magic. But as ice storms, acid clouds, and fireballs arced out, they were countered, dispelled, or simply blocked. After a minute or so of failed magic strikes, the elven forces finally began to move forward. As he watched, they picked up speed, but the large elven army wasn't even in their approach. The center moving faster as no doubt their best were leading the charge. As they neared the Almaran lines, the legionnaires hurled their javelins into the charging elves, and shortly after the lines clashed. Steve watched as the entire line was filled from end to end. Even in battle, he could spot the distinct lines of each unit of each cohort, their discipline in battle unwavering. The Almaran flanks, secured by Praetorians and the orcs on their wargs to keep the elves from spilling around the sides, but they were hitting the center hard. "This is going to be a slog," Neither side can really use artillery or archery or spells. He mentioned, and then blinked, opening his actual eyes as he released the bird from his hold. Now is as good a time as any. We need to go. As he said that, the four began to run across the field to the walls of the city in the distance. They were following along a river that ran out from the city. It wasn't the most pleasant river, seeing as they were using it to dispose of their sewage and the like, but Steve was more focused on the battle happening a few miles from them now. He had expected it to be louder. He could certainly hear it, but it wasn't distinct. It wasn't like he could hear the clash of sword on shield or anything explicit. It was just a distant rumble, like a storm on the horizon. "What if this entrance is better guarded than you expect?" Sherry asked as they jogged along up the river. "Then we'll deal with it. But I don't think it will be. It's a bad spot for an army to try and attack because it's a small entrance that's already well covered. Then they'd have to fight through literal shit in the sewers. It would be easy for the defenders to cover the entrances. So, just hope everyone else thought it was a bad idea. But again, we excel at those." Steve replied, trying to focus on the task at hand. The walls of the city rose above them as they came in close, a watermill of some kind, and a small group of buildings clustered up where the river exited the city. It didn't seem like anyone was around, but he could hear the gentle rumble of the grinder inside the mill being turned by the flow of water. "Why would anyone want to work somewhere that smells like this?" Larry asked as they moved through the buildings. "Work is work," Steve muttered. "It doesn't smell that bad to me." Fenrina mentioned as Steve yet again wondered how creatures with such amazing senses of smell weren't offended by such things, yet for some reason she detested peppermint. There weren't any archers waiting for them on top of the walls, which was good, and there, just like it should be, was the sewer entrance along the river. It was a low arch just over the river and its banks. The bars of iron had once likely been kept pristine, but without a serious threat in centuries they had been left to rust and age. But they were still iron bars. "So, hands of fire to melt them free?" Sherry asked, but Steve shook his head. "No, they're worked into the magistone." He pointed to the greenish stones of the arch. "It'll absorb the energy. Nope, this needs something else. This needs the stick." He clapped his hands as a relatively ordinary stick appeared within them, which made Fenrina's ears perk up immediately. "What? You said the stick was gone!" She gasped out as he quickly began to wave it around as she followed it with her eyes. "Who wants the stick?" he asked, waving it in the air. Me wants stick!" Fenrina gasped as she hopped up a bit, trying to bite the end of the stick. But Steve was too quick and tossed it through the bars, protecting the sewer entrance. In a flash, Fenrina ran up to them, howling as she yanked and pulled before the iron bars twisted, groaned, and then snapped. With her opening, she rushed in after the stick that clattered along the stone path besides the river. "And there's our way in," Steve said as he crouched down to slip in through the opening Fenrina had made. As he stood up inside, he let out a surprised gasp, as Fenrina was already standing before him faster than he expected, the stick in her mouth. "Okay. You want me to throw the stick again? I'll just—" He reached up to take the stick from the large werehusky, but as he did, she growled a bit. "I can't throw it again if you don't let me have it." "No take, only throw." She growled around it. Steve just frowned and reached up before clapping his hands on either end of the stick, which made it pop out of existence, as Fenrina whined and began to spin around looking for it. "Where's stick? Stick is safe, but we've got work to do. Stick later." As he said that, Fenrina looked at him, trying to make her eyes as big as possible as she whimpered and whined, and Steve had to cover his ears. "La la 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 la, no sad whiny Fenrina today. Work first." He then pointed forward, and Fenrina gave a frustrated snap at the air before stomping off. "Fine! Why is it never time for stick?" As she went ahead, Steve looked over at Sherry and Larry, who were staring at him. "What?" he asked. "It's always trouble when you use the stick," Sherry mentioned. "Is it even wise to be throwing a holy artifact?" Larry asked.